Good afternoon. We're really excited today to have such a large crowd on today's webinar. Thank you for joining to learn more about the Volunteer Generation Fund. My name is Emily Stock, and I'm the Project Manager for Volunteer Initiatives with AmeriCorps. Next slide. On today's call, you will learn about AmeriCorps, the agency, the Volunteer Generation Fund opportunity, the National Partnership for Student Success, and best practices in budget development. Next slide. On today's webinar, you will hear from myself, Emily Stock, and several of my colleagues at AmeriCorps, as well as Kate Cochran from the National Partnership for Student Success. Several of us will be talking during the presentation, and others you will hear from during the Q&A portion. Before I get started, I want to suggest that you hold your questions until the end of this presentation. It's possible that many of your questions may be addressed during this content, and waiting until the end will help our team answer the questions that were already addressed. When the time comes, we will take your questions verbally by raising your hand and being called on, or by writing them in the Q&A section of Zoom. All questions will be added to the FAQ section on the website, even if we don't have time to answer them during our time together today. Next slide. AmeriCorps is a federal agency for volunteerism and national service. AmeriCorps provides opportunities for Americans to serve their country domestically, address the nation's most pressing challenges, improve lives in communities, and strengthen civic engagement. Each year, the agency invests in grants for local nonprofit, community, tribal, and state organizations, places more than 250,000 AmeriCorps members and AmeriCorps senior volunteers in intensive service roles, and empowers millions more to serve long-term, short-term, or one-time volunteers. The agency also administers various direct funding opportunities like the Volunteer Generation Fund and Days of Service grant programs to support organizations to engage more Americans as volunteers to meet the needs of their community. Next slide. The Volunteer Generation Fund was authorized by the Edward M. Kennedy Serve America Act in 2009 to support organizations to boost the impact of volunteers to meet the needs of the community. To give you a better idea of the program, some examples of recent funding include create or expand web-based volunteer platforms to connect community-based organizations with more volunteers, provide capacity building mini grants to community-based organizations interested in leveraging evidence-based volunteer management practices, leading trainings focused on implementing volunteer management best practices, or creating a formal volunteer program at an elementary school. The Volunteer Generation Fund program is really about investing in the infrastructure of volunteer management. Next slide, please. President Biden's American Rescue Plan calls for Americans to come together to support their communities. As part of the American Rescue Plan, additional funds have been provided to the Volunteer Generation Fund grant program to help build up the volunteer base after the COVID-19 pandemic to help meet the needs of the community. Next slide, please. Something to keep in mind is the Volunteer Generation Fund is not a national service program. It does not come with AmeriCorps members or AmeriCorps senior volunteers. Volunteer Generation Fund funding can be used to develop and or support community-based entities to recruit, manage, and support volunteers, but not to pay volunteers or tutors. Again, it can be used to recruit, maintain, and manage volunteers. The application is due Tuesday, September 3rd by 5 p.m. Eastern. We'll talk more about the application requirements later. Next slide, please. AmeriCorps has recently released their strategic plan, which outlines the agency's goals over the next 5 years. The plan calls for the agency to partner with communities to alleviate poverty and advance racial equity, as well as to unite Americans by bringing them together in service. Please note, to receive priority consideration, applicants must show that the priority area is a significant part of the program focus and intended outcomes, and must include a high-quality program design. Proposing programs that receive priority consideration does not guarantee funding. Next slide, please. Additionally, the funding priorities for this funding opportunity for the Volunteer Generation Grant Fund program include programs that expand, launch, or improve high-impact tutoring, mentoring, and other school-based or out-of-school time programs in line with the new National Partnership for Student Success, which we'll hear about next. Programs that actively engage in removing structural racial inequities, advancing racial equality, and increasing opportunity in order to achieve sustainable change in communities. Efforts to help local communities respond to and recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. Programs that are likely to generate significant measurable improvements in the number of volunteers generated and retained. Initiatives that specifically recruit, train, and deploy volunteers as a strategy to address a clearly identified pressing community need or to address education. And activities that specifically recruit skill-based and pro bono volunteers. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kate Cochran for the National Partnership of Student Success. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Emily. I'm Kate Cochran, and I'm with the National Partnership for Student Success. The National Partnership for Student Success, or NPSS, is a 3-year effort led by the Biden-Harris administration, including the U.S. Department of Education and AmeriCorps, along with the Everyone Graduates Center at Johns Hopkins University, and a coalition of over 90 organizations committed to providing the academic, mental health, and other supports that our young people today need to succeed, given the unprecedented challenges that students, schools, educators, and communities have faced as a result of the pandemic. The NPSS brings together schools, districts, students, parents, government agencies, AmeriCorps programs, state service commissions, nonprofits, and others around the common goal of getting more trained people to support students in high impact and evidence-based roles, both in school and in out-of-school settings, so they can not only recover from the impacts of the pandemic, but succeed and thrive. The NPSS was launched at the White House on July 5th, alongside a call to action for an additional 250,000 Americans to become tutors, mentors, student success coaches, post-secondary transition coaches, or wraparound or integrated student support coordinators over the course of the next 3 years. Depending on the setting, people in these roles may be volunteers or full or part-time employees and work side by side with educators and other personnel in both school and out-of-school time contexts. The NPSS will support schools, districts, service commissions, and local agencies, as well as student support providers and community-based organizations to increase the number of students who are receiving these evidence-based and people-powered student supports based on locally determined needs. I encourage you to visit our website at partnershipstudentsuccess.org to get involved in the NPSS. Among other things, our website includes information on how to sign up as a supporting champion and how schools, districts, government agencies at a local and state level, and nonprofits can apply for technical assistance to implement or expand programs that provide people-powered supports to students. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. AmeriCorps is really excited to be a part of the National Partnership for Student Success, and we look forward to seeing the impact that our programs and our funding can have on our students. So to continue on with the important aspects of funding opportunity, wanted to call out that eligible applicants are those that are included on this slide, which are Indian tribes, institution of higher education, local governments, which do include school districts and K through 12 schools, nonprofit organizations, state service commissions, and states and U.S. territories. Next slide, please. The application will include these sections. Wanted to call out that applications may not exceed 10 double-spaced pages as according to the pages printed out from eGrants. So please print out your pages prior to submission to make sure that you have not exceeded the 10-page limit. The application page limit does not include the budget, performance measures, or any required additional documents. It just includes the narrative section. But again, please make sure that you print out the pages before you submit to make sure that you're within the 10-page limit that is called out in the notice of funding opportunity. Next slide, please. AmeriCorps will engage external reviewers with relevant knowledge and expertise to assess and provide input on the eligible applications. The review and selection process is intended to produce a diversified set of high-quality programs that represent the priorities and strategic considerations described in the notice. The sections are weighted with the percentages listed on this slide. Next slide, please. AmeriCorps is requiring grantees to report on these two performance measures, although you can select more in addition. Additional information about performance measures is listed in the application instructions on the website. Applicants may optionally select additional performance measures, as I've just mentioned. They can either be national performance measures or applicant-determined performance measures, but all performance measures must align with the 2022 VGS performance measure instructions that are posted on the AmeriCorps website. Next slide, please. You will learn more about the required match during the budget section of this webinar, but wanted to call out, since there's so many representations from schools here today, that the Department of Education American Rescue Plan elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds may be used to meet the grantee's share of required resources. So please keep that in mind as you're developing your budget if you have received any of those funds. And now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Tracy to provide information on the budget. Next slide, please.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Emily. I appreciate it. Hello, and welcome to what I like to call Best Practices in Budget Development segment of this webinar. My goal is to help you, the Volunteer Generation Fund applicant, acquire the knowledge and skills that you need to understand the function of and to develop an effective program budget and budget narrative. Your submission of a complete and high quality budget will help to demonstrate that you have the fiscal capacity to manage a Volunteer Generation Fund program. During this segment, my colleague Carissa Cuffey and I will holistically review the budget components that include both AmeriCorps resources and the applicant's matching resources that Emily was just discussing. When we finish, you should understand how to determine if the costs are allowable, reasonable, necessary, and allocable as determined by 2 CFR 200, which is the Office of Management and Budget's uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards. And this is frequently referred to as the uniform guidance. And you'll also use the content from the Notice of Funding Opportunity, which is frequently referred to as the notice. Using these resources and the tips and the best practices that we share here, you should be prepared to submit a compliant, compelling, and competitive budget. Before I get started in the details, I do want to repeat Emily's request that you hold your questions until the end of this presentation. We have a large amount of information to share with you, and I don't want you to miss any of it while you're focused on entering your questions in the panel. It's also likely, as you heard, that we might address it during the presentation. So if you think of a question and you want information or more information on a particular piece of what we're going through, just make a quick note of it. And when the presentation ends, we'll be more than happy to address all of your questions. So let's start by talking about the budget function. Because the budget and the budget narrative becomes part of the grant recipient's contract with AmeriCorps, we want and we expect applicants to present a strong and an accurate document. The approved Volunteer Generation Fund budget will not only serve as a financial guide for grant-supported activities, but it also helps to ensure compliance with the terms and conditions of the award. In addition to helping AmeriCorps monitor grant and financial compliance, it can serve as a tool for both AmeriCorps and the award recipient to measure progress toward the match requirements and to monitor budgeted expenses to actual expenses as part of a strong budget management process. Now, before we dive into the details of budget development, I do want to point out that budget development is just one component of an effective budget management process. So let's take a quick look at the full process. As you started to work on your Volunteer Generation Fund application, you might have asked yourself, How do I design a strong budget? I don't even know where to start. Whether or not you started the process with that question, as part of the pre-award project development process, it's likely that your team already determined the needs that you wanted to address with the Volunteer Generation Fund program resources. You set up program or project goals and objectives, and you decided on a strategy to accomplish those goals. And then to develop the budget, applicants must translate that strategy into dollars to prepare a budget that is aligned with the stated program goals and objectives. Post-award, grantees will continue to manage their budgets effectively by establishing a budget control process, monitoring expenses, that is, regularly comparing your budgeted to your actual expenses to check for over and underspending, and modifying the budget as necessary with approval from AmeriCorps when required. Today's conversation will focus on that budget preparation process. Once approved, your budget should be realistic. That is, it should reflect expected program revenues and expenses and its capacity to carry out those program activities. It should also be consistent and aligned with your program goals and objectives, and it should be flexible. A project's financial and operating circumstances often change. We know that, and we know that these budgets must adapt to the changing circumstances. So for now, we are going to focus on the realistic and consistent features of your budget, as they're the ones specific to budget design. So a few minutes ago, you may have heard me outline those steps that your team would have taken as part of budget development process. AmeriCorps strongly encourages applicants to approach budget design as a team activity, engaging various departments based on their individual expertise. For instance, your human resources department should have costs for salary and fringe benefits and national service criminal history checks. The program office should know the cost for training and evaluation and delivering services to your community. Your accounting office will have historical spending rates that you'll then update to include in this current budget. And your grants office should be able to review for compliance. And certainly other staff may have additional expertise and can review the budget for clarity. Now, I do realize that if you're part of a smaller organization, you may not have all of these resources available to you, but you still shouldn't consider taking budget development activities into a vacuum without input from others. Don't be afraid to reach out to others so that you can present more realistic data in your budget and make sure that that document aligns to your programmatic goals and objectives. You might want to have someone outside of your budget team review the budget to make sure that the content is clear and accurate. And definitely consider engaging board members or commissioners in support of your budget development process. Again, I never encourage anyone to take this on in a vacuum. It really is a way for you to check and double check your work and make sure that it is clear, compelling, and compliant. I mentioned about the accounting department having historical information. We recommend that applicants use historical information when it's possible. After obtaining this, generally, as I said, from the accounting office, then you will adjust it as necessary so that the data is timelier, and you'll include that information as appropriate as part of your budget narrative description so that you can explain how you came up with that calculation. Your strong budget design provides a framework for effective budget management, and it ensures a realistic scope, appropriate detail, a competitive and compelling proposal, compliance, and effective delivery. That is, it serves as a guide for program implementation. And in order to create a budget that is strong, accurate, and requires minimal clarification, I definitely encourage you to take your time and engage others in data collection and quality review. As I noted at the beginning of this segment, one of the objectives that I had is to provide you with tips and tools for creating that compelling and compliant budget narrative. The first tip is to read and follow the application instructions and the notice of funding opportunity. The strongest and most compliant budget narratives adhere to these guidelines in the guidelines in these documents rather, and that saves all of us time and effort down the road. These documents provide specific details related to budget compliance, including any required costs. I also encourage you to become familiar with the uniform guidance and only include those costs that are allowable, reasonable, necessary, and allocable. And you can find the uniform guidance online at ecfr.federalregister.gov under Title II, Grants and Agreement. After you and your team estimate the financial resources that you need to achieve the stated program goals, you will then organize them into the narrative's budget categories, again, following the guidance in the notice and in the application instructions. And as you develop the narrative, remember to provide adequate descriptions and clear calculations. eGrants will automatically populate a budget summary and a budget narrative report that should be able to serve as a standalone document without the need to go back and reference the application narrative for explanation. So this is where that suggestion to have someone outside of your budget development team review the document, what some of us like to call the mom test. You know, if mom can understand it, anybody can, but have somebody else look at this to check for holes and inaccuracies. The uniform guidance specifies costs that are considered unallowable, such as lobbying, entertainment, and alcoholic beverages. AmeriCorps strongly encourages applicants to review that uniform guidance to avoid including unallowable costs in your proposed budget. Other unallowable costs include those that are not necessary to meet your program objectives. For example, budgeting new computers and printers for each of your organization's 10 staff members. When you only have 3 staff members included on your budget, that's not allowable, and that could actually be considered waste, fraud, and abuse. Staying with the computer theme, another example would be maybe budgeting $4,000 for a high-end desktop computer that has all the fancy bells and whistles for an employee who is primarily going to use a word processing program and email. These are costs that would be considered unreasonable from a prudent person perspective, or they have no logical basis for inclusion in the budget. We talked a little bit about the match requirements earlier, but I will just repeat that these match requirements for volunteer generation fund grants increase each year, beginning with a 20% match requirement in the first year and increasing to a 50% match requirement in the 4th year and any later years in which a recipient receives a volunteer generation fund grant. This graphic shows what a budgeted 20% grantee share would look like for a grant with a total program budget of $125,000. In this example, the grantee share of $25,000 meets the 20% requirement. It's important to remember that the match is calculated on all budgeted costs, not just the AmeriCorps share. So in this example, it would be incorrect to look at that $100,000 AmeriCorps share and believe that 20% match is $20,000. $20,000 match included in a total $120,000 budget is just 16.7%, and that's non-compliant. So you must consider the full budget, both the AmeriCorps and the grantee share, when you're calculating match. Fortunately, eGrants calculates the budgeted match for you as you develop your budget. Now, I will caution you that eGrants rounds up. So if as you're looking at that budget narrative report and you see that you're currently matching at 20% and you know that your match requirement is 20%, it's a really good idea to just go offline and do a manual calculation outside of eGrants. Make sure that you didn't actually match at a lower rate, like 19.7% or something like that, and that it's appearing higher. Obviously, if you're budgeting at 25% and your match requirement is 20%, you know you've got it covered. But if your your budget narrative report shows the match being exactly what the requirement is, I always recommend that you go ahead and calculate it manually just to make sure you have met that threshold. Excuse me. When considering match, it's important to remember that if a cost is unallowable as part of the AmeriCorps share, it is also unallowable as part of the grantee share or your required match. Additionally, cash and in-kind contributions are acceptable as match when they are necessary and reasonable for proper and efficient accomplishment of program or project objectives, when they are allowable under the uniform guidance, the notice, and the application instructions, when they are included in the approved budget and allocable under program guidelines, when they are compliant with the terms and conditions of the award and the uniform guidance, and when they are verifiable from the organization's records. The matching resources must be treated the same as the AmeriCorps share, and consistent treatment includes complete and accurate documentation. A frequently heard phrase in the world of grants management is, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. So do please make sure to document all of your expenses. In order to fully demonstrate a plan for non-AmeriCorps support, applicants are required to include the source of matching funds in the budget narrative, enter a description of that source along with an amount, a cash or in-kind classification, the type of match source, that is, whether it is state or local government funds or private donations, and confirmation of whether the sources of match are secured or proposed. You do not need to secure 100% of your match prior to submitting your application. You may enter anticipated match by noting that it's proposed, but whether it is secured or proposed, the total in the source of funds section must equal the amount of match shown in your budget exactly. As you enter data into your budget, you will notice that the structure includes both the AmeriCorps and grantee share of project costs, and that the AmeriCorps share is identified in eGrants as the CNCS share. Additionally, the budget is divided into two different sections. Section 1 is for program operating costs. Specific line items may include those shown here on the slide. Section 2 is for your indirect costs, if you choose to include them in your budget, and that is your choice whether or not to do that. Volunteer Generation Fund applicants have a choice of two methods for calculating indirect costs, as shown here and as detailed in the application instructions. And we'll talk more about those two methods in just a few moments. As you, the Volunteer Generation Fund applicant, develop your budget management systems and specifically the budget control process, you will want to establish clear policies and procedures for tracking all and documenting all of the expenses here. So now I am going to pause and pass this session over to my colleague, Carissa Cuppy, who will discuss the specific content of your VGF budget. So Carissa, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Tracy. So let's take a look here at Section 1, Program Operating Cost. We will now review the specific Volunteer Generation Fund budget categories. As you enter your budget, details in each of these categories shown, be sure to follow any specific requirements that are outlined in the Notice of Funding Opportunity and the specific details in the application instructions, beginning on page 42. I'll highlight some instructions that are often result in a need for some additional information. I'll begin this review with, of course, letter A, personal expenses. Here in this category, you will individually list each staff position supported by the grant and provide the annual salary and the level of effort as percentage of full-time equivalent, or FTE, that is devoted to this award, or if calculated on an hourly basis, the hourly rate and number of hours per week. Additionally, you will include a brief statement of responsibilities for each staff member listed. Please remember to only include positions supported by the application narrative and Make sure not to include the value of direct community service performed by volunteers unless it is organizational functions such as accounting, auditing, or training. In addition, if you have multiple AmeriCorps grants, it is a good idea to confirm that you are not over budgeting. That is, including more than 100% staff time on your budgets. You can do this by including a statement in each line or by adding a $0 line item that states the percentage of time allocated to budgeted staff does not exceed 100% across all AmeriCorps grants. Now let's take a look at letter B. In the personal fringe benefit category, you will identify type of fringe benefit and the cost for each staff. The fringe benefit cost should align with salary lines, meaning it should only include staff included in the personnel expenses category, and these benefits should be calculated in alignment with category 1A calculations. If the benefit amount is more than 30% of salary cost, you must justify the cost by listing each benefit separately. So in other words, rather than entering fringe benefits at 41.65% of total salaries, you will break it out as something like health insurance, 24%, retirement, 10%, and FICA at 7.65%. Let's take a look at letter C, travel. The travel category is to support any local or long distance staff travel. When entering costs here, you should include the type of travel cost, such as ground transportation, airfare, lodging, and per diem. The number of trips and the number of staff traveling should be here as well. Make sure this calculation is clear and simple to follow. You should include only travel costs for staff listed in budget category 1A and who directly support the grant activities described in your application. Know that your budget mileage at a rate higher than the federal reimbursement rate is okay if it follows your organization's policy and is justified in your budget narrative. Let's take a look at letter D, equipment. AmeriCorps defines equipment as tangible, non-expendable personnel property having a useful life of more than 1 year and is at an acquisition cost of $5,000 or more per unit. So regardless of how your organization may define equipment, if the proposed expense does not meet this criteria, it goes in letter E, our supply category. You must show that the equipment unit cost and the number of units with the purpose of the equipment in this line item. Likewise, for letter E, supplies, you must show the type of supplies and their respective cost and individually list single items costing $1,000 or more. Let's take a look at letter F, our contractual and consultant services. This category includes all contracts and consultants supporting the project operations. You can convey that the costs are reasonable and necessary by including a daily or hourly rate or annual contract fee in the justification. This category should not include any training or evaluation consultants. That brings us to letter G, training. So here, please include the cost for training staff on the project. Include a daily or other basis for determining reasonableness if budgeting for consultants. Let's look at letter H, the evaluation section. This includes your project evaluation cost, additional staff, consultants, or any evaluation instruments and other related evaluation costs. This is not for assessing progress towards your performance measures, but as an evaluation of impact on the community and the assessment of the overall program design and systems. Like the other categories that includes consultants, please include that daily rate or the basis to determine reasonableness if you are including consultants in this category. And now let's look at letter I, our other program operating cost. This is like a catch-all category for those project expenses that don't neatly fit in the other categories. So in this category, you must include the National Service Criminal History Check costs for employees or other individuals who are receiving a salary or a similar payment from the grant. If you do not include those costs for these checks, please make sure to explain how these costs are covered, or that the checks are already completed for the applicable individuals. The category may also include those line items to cover costs for office space rental, utilities, phone and internet expenses, and other expenses that don't quite fit into those other categories. So now let's take a look at our section 2. In addition to the program operating cost, applicants may budget indirect costs in section 2. Indirect costs are general or centralized costs that support the project. They do not include specific project costs. They may be included in an organization's indirect cost rate if one exists, or calculated using the de minimis rate. The specifics for using these rates and documenting the details of them are in your application instructions. So some things that are very important to note are that if you already have a federally approved indirect cost rate, you must use this method and the approved rate agreement from the federal government that constitutes as the documentation of your indirect cost. eGrants will direct you to specify the rate type and to supply the rate and basis on which the rate is calculated. If you are budgeting for less than the maximum allowed, you should note the percentage claimed in the description. You must also enter the details of your approved negotiated indirect cost rate agreement in eGrants, using the guidance in the application instructions that are noted. And please, make sure that your budgeted rate matches the rate details entered in eGrants on that budget. Alternatively, applicants that do not have federally approved indirect cost rates may use the de minimis rate of 10% of the modified total direct cost, also known as MTDC. It is important to note that if you use the de minimis rate option, that the organization, you, must use it consistently across all the organization's federal awards. Like the federally approved indirect cost rate details, applicants must enter the details of the de minimis rate in eGrants if they are using it. As an alternative to using either of these methods, applicants may charge the cost as direct costs, providing that they meet the allowability standards outlined in the uniform guidance. Let's take a look at our source of funds. This is the last section of the budget narrative. In it, you won't list budgeted item sections or line item costs. Rather, you will enter the source of those resources that are covering the specific line item expense in eGrants, in the grantee share of the budget. As I said, the source of funds section provides details for the grantee share of all cash or in-kind resources included in the budget. Applicants will enter these details from the budgeted section 1 and 2 headings and click the link to enter source of matching funds, shown here. Once you click that link, a new screen will open for you to enter the source. Please be aware that there is a source of funds category for both section 1 and 2. You will use either or both, depending on where your budgeted resources are as part of the grantee share. Once you open the window for the source of matching funds, you will enter each source of matching resources separately, including a brief description of the match, whether it's secure or proposed, the dollar amount of the resources, the match classification, cash or in-kind resources, and the source type, such as private or state and local government. So please make sure to note each of these details. I caution you to update this section as well as the indirect cost section after making any budget revisions so they reflect all the changes. The source of funds total must be equal to the total amount of resources in the grantee's share of the budget exactly. So as long as we're discussing the match resources, I just really want to repeat what I stated earlier, that if a cost is unallowable as a part of the AmeriCorps share, it is also unallowable as part of the grantee share, your required match. Again, if you're not sure if the cost is allowable or not, the uniform guidance is the absolute best place to find these answers. So before we close, I want to offer a few pointers, beginning with the guidance to check and double check. Please check your work to eliminate any erroneous information. The notice and application instructions outline any of the budgeted restrictions and regulations, including the minimum match requirements. So please make sure to follow them. Your budget should include all required costs, such as the costs for our staff, national service criminal history checks. Your budget narrative will also demonstrate how you are supporting all budgeted match, source of funds section that includes required details and equals the total budgeted match exactly. Even if your budgeted match exceeds the minimum requirement, you must include the entire match in the source of funds section. As much as possible, due to eGrant's character limits, the budget narrative should detail many things, including the purpose and the actuate calculations in whole dollars, as Tracy mentioned earlier, and exclude unallowable costs, both those unallowed in the notice or application instructions and those unallowed by the regulations. I often recommend that applicants use the $0 line item to enter any additional clarifications if needed. And please have someone check all those calculations before you submit. On page 48 and 49 of your application instructions, it provides a checklist to help you determine if your budget is compliant with the instructions. I encourage you to review it as you finalize your budget content. And finally, most importantly, you should ensure that you align your budget narrative to the program goals in the application narrative, including any miscellaneous or other unidentified budget amounts that may adversely impact your application status. Again, I stress the benefit of involving your team and someone outside of the team in the budget development process. Having another set of eyes provides a review of the final budget and can make an incredible difference. In addition, before submitting your application, please make sure your organization has a registration and a valid unique entity identifier, also known as the UEI, with the System for Award Management, also known as SAM. You will be able to submit your application with the UEI only, meaning if you do not have a UEI, you cannot submit an application. So if you are applying for SAM for the first time, I recommend that you apply as as early as you can, as it may take a while to validate the registration. So please know that SAM is a free service and that your organization should never pay for a SAM registration. Further, know that applicants must maintain an active SAM registration throughout the application process. And if awarded a Volunteer Generation Fund grant, must maintain the active registration throughout the life of the grant. Applicants must use their SAM registered legal name and physical address in all AmeriCorps grant applications. The legal applicant's name and physical address in e-grants must match the applicant's SAM registered information. AmeriCorps will not make awards to entities that do not have a valid SAM registration and unique identity, a unique entity identity, UEI. You can find more information on SAM within the notice. Also, please make sure to submit your organization's operational and financial management survey as directed in the notice. There are details to help you align your eGrants information to your SAM registration, as well as a link to the OFMS, that's that Operational and Financial Management Survey, on the Manage Your page, on the Manage Your Grant page of the AmeriCorps website under the Pre-Award Requirement heading. You should also make sure that your organization's most recent single audit is on file with the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, and your Form 990 is submitted to GuideStar as applicable. And finally, if you are budgeting indirect costs, please be sure to enter your current federally negotiated indirect cost rate details or the de minimis rate details in eGrants using the guidance in the application instruction. Finally, AmeriCorps is aware that on occasion, applicants experience challenges with the eGrant system. eGrants automatically performs a limited compliance check to validate the budget, and it may result in a warning or error message. Some of the messages may prevent you from submitting your application, so you should be aware of the differences and related actions. For instance, when you receive a warning, you can move forward, but the application or the budget may not be compliant with the guidance. On the other hand, an error message will not allow you to move forward until you correct the error. So you must resolve all errors before you can submit your application. If you experience a challenge other than a warning or error message, you should contact the AmeriCorps hotline right away. The number is 800-942-2677. And the link to help request form is at the bottom of most eGrants pages. I want to draw your attention back to the bullets that I shared earlier. I encourage you to keep this checklist nearby as you develop your budget and frequently consult it as a budget development guide and the quality assurance checklist. Many budgets require extensive revisions, in part because applicants do not follow points outlined here. You will save yourself a great deal of follow-up effort by checking your proposed budgets against this checklist before submitting to AmeriCorps. And I hope that you found this instruction a helpful guide for developing your Volunteer Generation Fund budget and budget narrative. I encourage you to review the content from this presentation several times before submitting your application as part of your quality assurance process. And I wish you all the best as you develop your proposal and your related budget content. And at this time, we're happy to take any questions before we continue the rest of today's presentation.
Thank you, Carissa, and thank you, Tracy, for this very informative look at best practices in budget development. So before we open it up to verbal questions, I wanted to address a couple of the frequently asked questions that have been posted in the Q&A section of this chat. So first of all, most importantly, the application is due September 13th. I don't know if I said the 3rd or if it just sounded like it, but the application is due September 13th by 5 p.m. Eastern. That is what is posted in the NOFO, and that has not changed. So I just wanted to clarify that question. Additionally, As mentioned earlier, this is not a Volunteer Generation Fund is not a national service program. So it does not come with AmeriCorps members or AmeriCorps senior volunteers. VGF funding can be used to develop and or support community-based entities to recruit, manage, and support volunteers, but not to pay volunteers or tutors or AmeriCorps members. So that's it's used to rebuild the infrastructure of the volunteer management portfolio. So now, I think those are all the things I was going to address. So to ask a question verbally, select the raise hand icon and you will be placed into a queue. When we are ready for your question, we will unmute you. A prompt will display, confirm you want to unmute, and then ask your questions. And now I will ask my fellow panelists, you can come on camera and unmute yourselves, and we'll be ready for questions.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I put these in the Q&A as well, so apologies if I just couldn't figure out how to see the answer. But I just had a question about how many grants you're anticipating awarding and how competitive you think the application might be.
Yes, so we have not released an anticipated number of grants to approve. We know that we have released a minimum, which is we will award a minimum of $100,000, which is a per year award for the multi-year program. And that's what that's the information that we know as we have it.
I mean, so okay, so you no idea of like how many organizations you think might apply?
No, we have no idea.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry. Yep. Another question that has been asked a couple different times in the chat and the Q&A is, will this call is being recorded, this webinar is being recorded, and it will be shared. It usually takes about a week for us to get it posted, but it will be shared. Some of the questions in the Q&A have been answered in writing during this time. If we don't get to all of your questions, they will all be shared in the FAQ, which is posted on the website. So I will go ahead. Oh, go ahead.
Craig is unmuted and he has his hand up.
Okay, great.
Yeah, hi. Very early in the application, you're asked to identify what state your application, your project's intended for. But what if you're going to be helping many states? How would you identify that?
Someone want to take that?
Hi, Emily. This is Jamie Crispin, Senior Portfolio Manager. And Greg, I don't know if you're referring to, there is a section when you start your application where you have to write down the legal applicant name, and it has you pick a state. So I think that's one thing I just wanted to clarify. Is that the piece you're talking, or are you talking more about inside of the narrative portion of the application?
So right after that, then there's something, I forget exactly what the naming is. I'd have to bring the application back up. But you're at, I think since eGrants is normally aimed at state commissions, it asks you to identify the state in which the work is going to take place. But we want to make a proposal that affects many states.
Yeah, so I'll answer, and I hope this gets to it. I will say that our application will ask for your legal applicant name, and you will want to write down generally the address of wherever your headquarters or main office is. So, that's generally how we see on the first part of the application. And then the second piece is Volunteer Generation Fund. There are no kind of state boundaries here. You are able to write into either the executive summary or in some sections of the narrative where the service or where you anticipate the activities will happen in. And then you can certainly list all of the locations in the actual budget narrative. But I think your section is talking, I do think you will have to identify a state. And Tracy, if you have additional information that you want to tag in here on, but generally wherever your legal applicant name that you're going to write in the application that will then also match our system award management or SAM, those two have to align. And so you will have to pick a state for that purpose of wherever generally your headquarters or wherever the information that will align in SAMs.
Thanks, Jamie. You hit the one point that I would have added on there about the alignment with SAM. So perfect.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to find the exact session and I'll put it in the question and answer because I still have a little question, but we'll move on from the conversation part.
All right, next up we have Tanya.
Hi, so I'm here on behalf of a museum. I was wondering, is this grant more appropriate for institutions that have volunteers that go out to many different institutions, or can this be applicable to just us and our volunteer management infrastructure?
Absolutely. This is Jamie Crispin. Hi, Tanya. And absolutely, you can use this to support your own volunteer infrastructure. You do not have to, there isn't any requirement that your volunteers have to extend beyond your organizational or your mission goals, although it certainly could. So you're fine to propose a program or activities that will support your museum, as long as it's increasing, engaging, and recruiting volunteers.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes,
I can.
Go ahead, Mary.
Yes. So my quick question is about the time frame of the grants. I believe it says that they're generally 3-year grants, but then there's information about the match for year 4 and up. So can we write these as 4 or 5-year grants, or do they need to stick with the 3-year time frame?
I'm happy to take that one. So these are 3-year grants, and you'd have the one or the 10%, 20%, 30%. If then there is a renewal period and you would apply again for a renewal of your grant, then you would be entering into year 4. And it's from, that point there we're building on from the 4 years and upward. So that's where that language about year 4 comes into play. But for these initial applications, they are 3-year awards.
Thank you.
Certainly.
Evan, go ahead.
Hello, I had a quick question. We are looking at purchasing an online platform where nonprofits could post volunteer opportunities. But would that platform, would that be something that would fall under supplies, or would that be something under other program operating costs?
Evan, it will depend on the cost and the lifetime of it. The definition of supplies is very clearly written in the application instructions. So I encourage you to look at that, to look at equipment. If it's a contract, it might even be that it goes in the contractual section. So it's really, you'll have to look at those definitions and see where it fits most clearly.
Awesome, thank you.
Certainly.
Alyssa?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome. So we worked on starting the registration yesterday, and we don't have a UEI, an LBN, or a CAGE, or an office code in the SAM program. We were just kind of wondering what we do about that or how we get around that.
So the short answer is you can't get around it.
Okay.
Because as you heard Carissa say, you need that UEI. But you will go through the system, you will register for SAM, you'll get all of that information. It does take a while. So I encourage you, as soon as you get off this webinar, maybe that's when you start to apply for that registration, because we want to make sure that you have ample time to get that registration up and validated before the due date. And I
So upon
believe
validation, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Right, no, I was going to say, I believe the process is pretty clearly identified. If not, I know that there is a system for award management, a help desk, or customer service line or something like that, that they can also be supportive, I'm sure.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I
I think
we're
that
at-
oops, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, ask your question.
Yes, thank you.
I was gonna say, I know we're at time. There's a question there's several questions that have come in the Q&A that are the same that I did want to ask verbally so we can address all of them. And it's, are we writing a 1-year budget or a 3-year budget?
So your budget is a 1-year budget. You're proposing the cost required to run your program for the first year of what will be a 3-year award.
Okay. And I know we are at time and want to respect everyone's time. We will continue to answer questions. We have documented the questions that have come in through the Q&A and the chat. We will answer them on the FAQ that is part of, that is posted on the website. And you can always reach out to volunteergeneration@cns.gov for additional questions. I want to thank you for your time today. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your interest in the Volunteer Generation Fund. And we look forward to reading your applications.